There is a moment in modern history that most people have already forgotten. A moment so brief, so quiet, so easily overlooked that even those who lived through it did not fully understand what they were witnessing. It was February 22. Russian armored columns were crossing into Ukraine from multiple directions simultaneously. Missiles were striking Kiev in the early morning hours. And inside the walls of the Ukrainian presidential administration, intelligence reports were arriving every few minutes, each one darker than the last. The assessments from Western intelligence agencies were brutally clear. Kyiv would fall. The government would collapse. And the president of Ukraine, a former television comedian with no military background, no combat experience, and no real history of navigating existential crisis, would either flee the country, surrender, or be killed within the first 72 hours. That was the expectation. That was the plan. That was what every major power on earth privately believed would happen. And then Volodymyr Zelensky picked up his phone, walked outside into the dark streets of Kyiv, stood in front of a camera with his advisors beside him, and told the entire world in a shaky, exhausted, but completely unbroken voice that he was still there. He was not running. He was not negotiating from a safe location abroad. He was not forming an exile government in Warsaw or Berlin or Washington. He was standing on the streets of his capital city, and he was staying. That single decision, that one moment of refusal, became the hinge point of modern European history. And tonight, we are going to talk about why. We are going to talk about a man that Russia wanted to erase from the earth, a man that Europe desperately needed to survive, and a man whose choices over the following months and years permanently transformed the security architecture of an entire continent in ways that the world is still only beginning to understand. Because this story is not simply about bravery. It is not simply about one man standing up to a powerful enemy. This story is about something far more complex, far more strategic, and far more historically significant. This is the story of how Volodymyr Zelensky, a man most of the world did not take seriously, became the most consequential political figure in 21st century Europe. To understand what Zelensky did, you have to understand what Europe looked like before the invasion, because the Europe of January 2022 was a very different place from the Europe we live in today. After the Cold War ended, something gradual and almost invisible began happening across the continent. European governments started making a quiet assumption, an assumption so comfortable, so economically convenient, and so psychologically appealing that almost nobody wanted to challenge it. The assumption was simple. Large-scale war in Europe was over. The age of industrial conflict, of massive armies clashing across borders, of nations mobilizing entire economies for military survival, that age was finished. History had moved on, and Europe, exhausted from centuries of devastating warfare, was more than happy to believe it. So European militaries shrank, defense budgets fell, ammunition stockpiles thinned out, military production capacity weakened. Entire generations of European citizens grew up without ever seriously contemplating the possibility that tanks might roll across their continent again. Politicians focused on trade agreements, climate policy, economic integration, and social programs. War was something that happened far away, in the Middle East, in Africa, in places that seemed strategically distant from the comfortable streets of Paris and Berlin and Brussels. And into this comfortable assumption, Europe built its energy policy, its economic relationships, its strategic dependencies. Germany built pipelines to Russia. European economies became deeply intertwined with Russian energy. The logic seemed rational at the time. Economic interdependence would reduce conflict. Trade would create stability. Shared financial interests would gradually moderate even the most aggressive regimes. This was the foundational belief of European foreign policy for nearly 3 decades after the Berlin Wall came down. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and every single one of those assumptions collapsed almost overnight. But here's the part that most people still do not fully appreciate. It was not just the invasion that shattered those assumptions. Invasions happen. Aggressions happen. History is full of moments when powerful countries attack weaker ones. The world expresses outrage, and then life gradually returns to its previous patterns. What made this moment different, what made it historically irreversible, was Ukrainian resistance. And specifically, it was Zelensky's decision to transform that resistance into something far larger than a military campaign. From the very first days of the war, Zelensky understood something that most politicians in his position would never have grasped. He understood that Ukraine could not defeat Russia on the battlefield alone. The military gap was simply too enormous. Russia had more soldiers, more tanks, more artillery, more missiles, more aircraft, more everything. Pure military logic said Ukraine should lose and lose quickly. So Zelensky fought on a different battlefield. He fought on the battlefield of narrative, of emotion, of political psychology. And on that battlefield, he was extraordinarily, almost frighteningly effective. Every speech he gave was carefully constructed to do one specific thing, not just to ask for weapons, not just to generate sympathy, but to make European governments and European citizens feel that Ukrainian survival was directly connected to their own survival. He stood in front of the European Parliament and reminded them of what their grandparents had fought for. He addressed the British Parliament and invoked Churchill. He spoke to the American Congress and reminded them of Pearl Harbor and September 11th. He appeared before the German Bundestag and forced Germans to confront decades of uncomfortable strategic complacency. Every appearance carried the same deeper message beneath the surface. This war is not happening to someone else. This war is happening to you. Ukraine is your front line. And if Ukraine falls, the question of where the next front line will be is a question Europe will have to answer very quickly. That message resonated, slowly at first, then with extraordinary speed. European governments that had initially offered little more than symbolic support began making historic policy reversals. Germany, a country that had spent decades making military restraint a cornerstone of its national identity, announced a complete transformation of its defense policy almost overnight. The German government committed to massively increasing military spending. Old restrictions on weapons exports to conflict zones were abandoned. The political language around military power changed fundamentally in a country where that language had been almost taboo for generations. Finland, which had maintained careful neutrality for decades specifically to avoid provoking Russia, applied for NATO membership. Sweden, which had been militarily neutral for over 200 years, followed. Poland dramatically accelerated already ambitious military expansion programs. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, intensified border defense and military procurement at a pace that would have seemed extreme just months earlier. NATO, which some analysts had begun quietly describing as strategically obsolete, suddenly discovered a unity and sense of purpose it had not possessed in years. The alliance expanded. Its eastern flank strengthened. Military exercises intensified. Stockpiles began rebuilding. Defense production contracts multiplied across the continent. And all of this happened because Ukraine refused to fall, because Zelensky refused to run. But there is another dimension to this story that goes beyond politics and military spending, because the Ukraine war did something else to Europe that is perhaps even more profoundly significant in the long run. It changed how Europe thinks about power itself. For decades, the dominant intellectual framework inside European foreign policy circles was built around the idea that hard power, military force, territorial control, coercive pressure was becoming less and less relevant in the modern world. Soft power was the future. Economic leverage, diplomatic pressure, multilateral institutions. The idea that sophisticated modern nations could navigate global competition without fundamentally relying on military strength had become deeply embedded in European strategic culture. Ukraine destroyed that framework completely. Because what Europe watched unfold on its eastern border was not a sophisticated diplomatic dispute being managed through international institutions. It was tanks. It was missiles striking civilian infrastructure. It was cities being reduced to rubble. It was the raw, brutal, utterly unambiguous language of military force being used by a major power to attempt the conquest and elimination of a neighboring nation. And Europe realized, with a speed and clarity that was almost shocking, that it had forgotten how to speak that language, or more accurately, it had convinced itself it no longer needed to. The Ukraine war proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Zelensky consistently pushed this point home. In speech after speech, meeting after meeting, conversation after conversation with European leaders, he returned to the same uncomfortable truth. The world has not changed as much as you wanted to believe. Power still matters. Military strength still matters. The willingness to use force, or to credibly threaten its use, still shapes the behavior of governments and the fates of nations. Pretending otherwise is not idealism. It is dangerous self-deception. European leaders heard him, and gradually, painfully, they began to change. The transformation was also technological, because one of the most important things that happened during the Ukraine war was that the entire world got to watch in real time how modern warfare actually works in the 21st century. And what they saw was profoundly different from the military doctrines that most European defense establishments had been built around. Drones changed everything. Small, cheap, commercially available drone technology became one of the most tactically significant elements of the entire conflict. Ukrainian forces used drones for reconnaissance, for targeting, for direct attack, for psychological pressure. The battlefield became saturated with unmanned systems operating at a scale and sophistication that traditional military planners had not fully anticipated, and the implications for how wars would be fought in the future were enormous. Electronic warfare intensified at levels that exposed weaknesses in communication systems across the board. Cyber operations became inseparable from physical military action. Satellite intelligence, once the exclusive domain of superpower governments, became accessible and operationally decisive in ways that transformed battlefield awareness. And perhaps most importantly, the war demonstrated that adaptability, the ability to rapidly integrate new technologies, modify tactics, and respond to changing conditions faster than your opponent, could matter as much as raw military mass. Ukraine adapted, and it adapted with remarkable speed. Ukrainian engineers, programmers, and military innovators developed solutions to battlefield problems in weeks that traditional military procurement processes would have taken years to address. Civilian technology companies contributed directly to military operations. Crowd-funded military innovation emerged as a genuine force multiplier. The line between civilian technological capacity and military operational effectiveness blurred in ways that raised fundamental questions about how modern nations should think about defense. European military establishments watched all of this with intense attention, and the lessons they drew are now actively reshaping defense doctrine, procurement priorities, and strategic planning across NATO. Drone manufacturing programs are expanding rapidly across multiple European countries. Cyber defense investment has surged. Electronic warfare capabilities are being urgently upgraded. And the philosophical shift toward valuing technological adaptability alongside traditional military mass is visible in defense planning conversations from Warsaw to Paris to London. None of this transformation, not the political shifts, not the military spending increases, not the doctrinal changes, not the technological acceleration, none of it happens at this speed without Zelensky's wartime leadership generating the psychological and political pressure that made it all necessary. Which is why some of the most serious strategic analysts now argue that Zelensky's greatest historical achievement may not be what happens on the battlefield at all. His greatest achievement may be what he forced to happen inside the minds of European leaders and European citizens. He forced a psychological reckoning, a confrontation with uncomfortable truths that Europe had been successfully avoiding for 30 years. A recognition that security is not something you inherit from history or guarantee through trade agreements. Security is something you build, maintain, and are always prepared to defend. That recognition is now embedded in European strategic culture in a way that is very unlikely to reverse itself regardless of how the war eventually ends. Because once a society internalizes the reality of military threat at the scale Europe has experienced it since 2022, that internalization tends to persist. The fear does not disappear when the immediate crisis fades. It shapes institutions. It shapes budgets. It shapes the questions politicians ask and the answers their electorates are willing to accept. Europe is now a continent that thinks about defense differently, plans for contingencies it once considered unthinkable, invests in capabilities it once considered unnecessary, and prepares for a strategic future that looks far more competitive, far more dangerous, and far more demanding than the comfortable post-Cold War world it spent 3 decades convincing itself it lived in. And Vladimir Putin, the man who ordered the invasion expecting a quick victory, expecting Ukrainian collapse, expecting European division and American hesitation, Vladimir Putin triggered all of this. He pushed the button that started the machine that is now producing the most significant remilitarization of Europe since the Second World War. The irony is almost too large to fully comprehend. Russia invaded Ukraine to weaken Western influence near its borders, to fracture NATO, to demonstrate that the post-Cold War security order could be rewritten by military force. And instead, Russia produced a stronger NATO, a more militarized Europe, a more unified Western alliance, and a continental security architecture far more hostile to Russian ambitions than anything that existed before February 2022. That is the geopolitical legacy of the decision to invade. And standing at the center of that legacy, refusing to move, refusing to run, refusing to stop speaking the truth about what was happening and what it meant, was Volodymyr Zelensky. The man Putin wanted dead. The man Europe needed alive. History has a way of placing the right person in the right moment under conditions that nobody could have designed or predicted. And sometimes when that happens, the consequences extend far beyond anything anyone involved could have imagined at the beginning. Zelensky did not set out to reshape European security. He set out to survive, to keep his country alive, to hold a line that almost nobody believed could be held. But in holding that line, he changed something fundamental about the continent watching him hold it. He reminded Europe what it had forgotten. He showed the world what refusal looks like when it is genuine. And he forced a reckoning with reality that the most comfortable, most prosperous, most peaceful continent in human history desperately needed, even if it did not want it. The war continues. The battlefield remains brutal and uncertain. The diplomatic path forward remains deeply complicated. Many questions about Ukraine's future and Europe's future remain unanswered. But one thing is already settled, already written into history in a way that cannot be undone. The Europe that existed before Zelensky refused to run no longer exists. A new Europe is being built in its place, harder, more alert, more militarily serious, more honest about the world it actually lives in. And that transformation, that permanent, irreversible transformation of an entire continent's strategic consciousness, that is the true measure of what one man's refusal to surrender actually meant.